Good morning. I trust that you all slept well at the lovely Sheraton, which was renovated during COVID, by the way. That's why it's so nice. So I'm so glad it was available for us. There's nothing stranger than talking into a microphone that does not broadcast sound. I just have to say, this is extremely odd. So anyway, thanks again for being with us here this morning. Yesterday was an incredibly stimulating conversation, series of presentations. All of this is living on YouTube. So if you'd like to share with your students or with your communities, the constituencies, et cetera, please encourage you to do so. We'll make sure you have the links available so that you can tweet it out or send it out or share however you see fit. This morning, I could not be more excited to have Sarah Longwell with us this morning to give us this keynote address for the conference today. I follow her religiously on The Bulwark. She is a producer of The Bulwark, and if those of you who do not know what The Bulwark is, I assume many of you do, but it's a series of podcasts and other publications that's led by Charlie Sykes and includes a number of luminaries, Tim Miller, Sarah Longwell, JVL, whose name I always don't really quite know because he goes, Jonathan B. Last, right, but he goes by JVL. Excellent, excellent commentators with a Substack and with podcasts, et cetera. And what Sarah does on this, on the podcast, is her role is to interview a series of focus groups. And so she's very, very well known for her focus groups that reveal incredibly interesting information about voters across the spectrum. Most recently, she's been interviewing swing voters, the 4% of the voters that moved from Trump to Biden in the 2020 election, and the information that they reveal is incredibly fascinating. So I definitely commend Sarah's podcast to you, The Focus Group. She's also president and CEO of Longwell Partners, which is a communications firm in D.C. She's co-founder of Defending Democracy Together, a nonprofit organization, and she's director of the Republican Accountability Project. Notable past projects for Defending Democracy Together are Republican Voters Against Trump and Republicans for the Rule of Law. And she is, as I said, a publisher for The Bulwark. She's a longtime Republican strategist. She's a Pennsylvanian, as am I. And her most recent podcast is about the elections in Pennsylvania. I commend that to you. It just came out, I think, yesterday or this morning, describing the race between Mastriano and Shapiro and other races in Pennsylvania. And since that's such an incredibly important battleground state, it really is worth a listen. So without further adu, I want to invite Sarah to the podium. Sarah, thank you so much for being here.
Into that for it to be recorded?
I believe so. Where's Carol?
Yes.
Yes.
So let's just put one of those.
So this okay?
Yeah.
Sorry. Music kept moving.
That's okay. I tried to wander a little bit, but I'll try to stay close.
You want to do that too.
Yeah. So I was just told, just before this started, that this is all going to be public, which means I've got to rethink whether or not I'm going to tell you all the things that I was going to tell you. So, yeah, how many of you guys have heard of The Bulwark? Do you know what The Bulwark is? That's great. Okay. So I'm the publisher of The Bulwark. I own The Bulwark. I started it because I had, actually, you know what? I'm going to back up for a second before I tell you about The Bulwark. So I went to Kenyon College in Ohio, grew up in central Pennsylvania, was always a Republican. I grew up as we were just talking about Pennsylvania. People know about Pennsylvania. There is Philly on one side, there's Pittsburgh, and there's like Kentucky in the middle. And I grew up in an 800-person town in that part of Pennsylvania. It's a great state with a lot of interesting politics happening right now. I went to Kenyon College in Ohio, and then when I graduated, I went to work at this place called the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Do you guys know ISI? It's a think tank in Delaware. It's actually right across from Joe Biden's house. And when I was there, my boss was a woman named Christine O'Donnell. Do you guys know who Christine O'Donnell is? She was very famously not a witch, and she was the candidate for Senate. She unseated in a Tea Party primary a guy named Mike Castle, very nice moderate Republican from Delaware. Unseated him to go on to lose to now Senator Chris Coons, and she ended up leaving for a variety of reasons, and I got her job running communications at ISI. Which was great. But the first thing ISI was doing while I was running communications was they were publishing Rick Santorum's book. So it's 2005. Rick Santorum has become famous for two reasons. One, people think he might be the next George W. Bush. He also was the leader in the fight against gay marriage. And he had just become famous for saying that gay marriage was like bestiality. And so I was just coming out to my parents, and so it was just me and Rick Santorum on the road together. And this was a very funny time in my life because everywhere we went, people would glitter bomb him. I don't know if you guys remember glitter bombing, but it was like an activist thing that they did back then. And he was talking about why gay marriage was, going to ruin the country. And one day I was there, and there was this kid that was there. So there's always protesters. There's two women, and they brought their 13-year-old daughter. And it was at the headquarters at ISI, and the kid was holding a sign that said, "My two moms take me bowling." And for some reason, I was like, you know what? I quit. That was somewhere there's a grown person who was the reason I ended up leaving that job. And so for penance for that, for having been on the road with Rick Santorum, I went and I got a normal job at a communications firm, a Republican communications firm where they didn't do any social issues, a lot of economic policy, which I liked at the time, or at least was focused on at the time, felt nice and safe to 25-year-old me. But as penance, I joined the Log Cabin Republicans. You're all wondering, where's this all going? It's fine. I promise there's a point. So I joined the Log Cabin Republicans, which was a bunch of 70-year-old gay men and me. And I was just a volunteer, and this was my penance. And actually, I loved it. It was awesome because it was my first taste of real politics. If you're in D.C., you're doing policy work. Policy work is fine, but this was politics. And we were working on, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. We were working on gay marriage. And it's where I learned the most central strategy, theory on politics that animates everything I do today. And it's about margins. It's about how you fight to convince a small group of people that you need to create a majority. So back then is when I learned that you didn't need to get all Republicans on board for gay marriage or for Don't Ask, Don't Tell. You needed 4. You needed 5. You needed Susan Collins and Olympia Snow. And to focus on those margins. Basically everything that I think about politics is like Joe Pesci's speech from Any Given Sunday where he talks about clawing for the 5 inches in front of your face. So, which brings me to my presentation. So, you may have noticed that democracy is under threat. And I was here yesterday, so I know everybody knows this, and there was a lot of pessimism in the room. But everybody was talking about, election administration, laws. I don't know anything about any of that. What I do know is, and what I'm doing right now, you heard a bunch of, the things that I do, and they probably didn't mean anything to you, right? So Republican Accountability PAC and Republican Accountability Project are extensions of what I did in 2020 when I launched Republican Voters Against Trump. After that firm that I mentioned, I was there for about 15 years when Trump happened. And when Trump happened, I found myself in rooms with lots of sad Republicans and saying, with all of us being like, well, what do we do? And that's where I met Bill Kristol and Linda Chavez and Mona Sharon and Charlie Sykes and all of the people that I would go on to start the Bulwark with and all of these projects. Bill Kristol and I started this group, Defending Democracy Together, in 2018. And our first big idea was we were going to primary Trump. And we were talking to a bunch of people. It's public that Larry Hogan was considering it. And so, I'm trying to talk somebody into primarying this guy. And everybody kind of wants to know, there was a lot of people interested in doing it at the time, can he be beaten? And so I started, because when Trump happened, it occurred to me I had spent far too much time in think tanks, far too much time in DC, and I had no idea what was going on with Republican voters, which is a big part of what I want to talk about today. But doing the focus groups, I realized there was no way to primary Trump because the voters were there. Not all of them, but most of them. And I also thought, well, if you could defeat Trump, so I devoted myself to defeating Trump in 2020. We ran Republican voters against Trump. We were not the Lincoln Project. We were a different group. And what we did was, it was a persuasion. I know when you have to convince Republicans to vote against their tribe, you needed to create permission structures for them to vote for Biden. And so we are the group that made thousands of testimonials. We produced thousands of testimonials of Republican voters talking about why they were going to vote for Joe Biden and not Donald Trump. In many cases, they were talking about not why they would vote for Joe Biden, which is why they weren't going to vote for Donald Trump. Because I was thinking about 4% of people. How do you get to 4% of people and get them to not vote for Trump, even though they're tribally Republican? They think he did a good job on the economy, they like his policies, but how do you get to them? And the main strategy was, because in all my years of communications work, one of my greatest lessons is that people have the collapsing faith in institutions, but the one thing that they do still trust is people like me. Not me, but them. People like themselves. That's where they get their information. So we made we talked to all these disaffected voters. We made huge lists of hundreds of thousands of disaffected Republicans. We built relationships with them. We got them to make these testimonials, and then we put $35, $40 million behind them in key states. We're doing that again now. I thought if you could beat Trump, as a longtime Republican, I was laboring under what I think is a bit of a delusion that, if Trump's a cancer on the party, if you cut him out, muscle memory, bounce back. 2022 is just the world showing me how little I know about anything. Because Trump has, to the extent that he's a cancer, he's metastasized. And there are now, as many people have mentioned, we are swimming in anti-democracy candidates. And while a lot of people here are talking about administration and things like that, I just want to talk about why you have to beat anti-democracy candidates. You have to defeat them. The number one way to defend democracy right now is to win elections. Now I'm going to start my slides. So winning elections, number one way to protect democracy. It is also, incidentally, the only way that the Republican Party, and we can talk about this a little later. I want to talk about voters. I want to talk about, the Republican Party. But the only way you get to something better than where we are is through a sustained electoral defeats. And if I had to sum up the number one problem in politics today, it is that one party has gone off the rails, anti-democracy, and the other party is insufficiently popular to deliver sustained electoral defeats to that party. So how do you build the biggest, broadest pro-democracy coalition that you can? Spoiler alert, it's not by talking about democracy. I do want to just say where I threw it up there, I changed my presentation because Rick and I were covering a lot of the same ground, and so all this is new to me too. I wrote it last night. But one thing I want to say is that, this is a moment where I think there's a lot of fear, right, that Republicans are behaving this way, but Democrats will start behaving this way the second it's on them. And there's a lot of people who I think are yeah, I think that's true. I would say there's a real opportunity right now to create for Democrats a culture in which that is unacceptable, right? Because that's something Republicans do. I mean, Stacey Abrams, I think one of the reasons, there's a couple of reasons why she's having so much trouble in Georgia, but one of them is when she said, in 2018, that she wasn't going to concede and was talking about, it was a different situation, but she didn't know, right? She didn't know that in 2020 that election denialism was going to become the number one thing that we would all decide is absolutely intolerable. And I think it's really hurting her, right? She doesn't have the moral authority now to condemn Donald Trump. And I think so Democrats, I think that's something that they should take away from this, or it's a moment to dig in on that. All right, but the reason the elections are so important, as many people have noted, is that these are the people who are going to, there's a lot of people in my world are like, we got to talk about 24. And I'm always trying to explain to them, you wouldn't believe how, not disengaged, but how much different 22 is than 20, right? Trump is this like animating thing for people. He gets everybody all wound up. And they don't seem to realize that there's just like, Trump is like a gremlin you put water on, and like there's just everywhere now. There's all these election deniers running around, running for office. And if they win, they're all going to certify the next, or not, they're all going to be in charge of 2024 when he runs again. So the number one question I get asked as somebody who was a Republican my whole career is just like, what happened to the Republican Party? And I actually think it's important to talk about, because I think sometimes people, they think that like Trump is this natural extension of kind of Bush-Romney, and I can't tell you how wrong that is. Like, the party is so different from the one that I grew up in, came up in. You know, the party now is a total rejection of Bush-era foreign policy and Romney-Ryan economic policy. It is becoming more economically populist. It is a party that is still like rethinking what it stands for. Like growing up, it was easy to talk about what it meant to be a conservative. Limited government, free markets, American leadership in the world. Throw some other stuff in there, patriotism, character counts, sort of the ethos of it all. That's not what it's doing right now. It's different. And there's been these huge coalitional shifts. Donald Trump was a Democrat who was like was protectionist on trade and an anti-immigrant demagogue. And he saw something going on in the Republican Party before everybody else. And then there's this Russian expression that I really like called the appetite increases while you're eating. Because there was an appetite among some percentage of Republicans for Trump. But then he changed people as he went, and I could see this transformation going on in real time when we were thinking about primarying him. And as a result, the party now is trying to be the party of a multi-ethnic working class coalition. Does that sound weird to people? Do you not believe me? So they want, trust me, the Republicans now want to make sure that people think Democrats are the party of Wall Street, the party of the elite, and there is a reason these coalitional transformations, the college-educated suburban voters are the people that I target when I'm looking for my 4%. Because Donald Trump is trying to pick up Hispanics, white, black, working class voters on a values basis. And it's working. If you just took in raw numbers, which part of the coalition do you want? Do you want working class voters of all kinds? Or do you want college educated suburban voters? Which do you think there's more of? It's working class voters. So this is what I call, this is TM, can't take it. The Republican triangle of doom is my explanation. Usually I don't have a slide, so I do this. But it is the toxic and symbiotic relationship between GOP elected officials, the right-wing infotainment media, and the voters. And let me explain how that worked in 2020, because we saw it. Right after the election, Donald Trump's telling everybody the election's stolen, right? Before the election, he was telling everybody it was going to be rigged. In 2016, he was telling people it was going to be rigged. But voters weren't like all thinking that the election was rigged. There was this kind of base that did. But the base, those base voters demanded that their media tell them that the election was stolen, because Fox didn't do it. Number of focus groups of Trump voters that I have sat through where they tell me that they watch OANN or Newsmax now because Fox is liberal, because they called Arizona for Trump. So they built an entire new ecosystem of right-wing media that was popularized after the 2020 election. The elected officials need to reach their base voters, and so they go on Steve Bannon's War Room. They go on whatever these shows are. And when the elected officials go on, it provides another layer of legitimacy to them. And that just feeds on itself to the point where now 70% of Republican voters believe that the election was stolen. They believe that to varying degrees. Remind me in the Q&A to talk a little bit about that. But the majority of the party, vast majority of the party, does believe that the election was stolen. So Trump lost and election denialists won. So right now, I don't know if anybody did the numbers. If you did, Rick, yesterday, I missed like the first 15 minutes. But majority of the GOP nominees on the ballot right now denied that the election was legitimate. It's 299. 174 running in safe Republican seats. 174 will already be in there, we know it. Now I care about the 51, it's actually less than that. So there'll be 51 that are gonna be in contested races. So Republican Accountability PAC, right now the work that I'm doing, what I'll go back to the office to do on Monday, what I was doing on the way here, is spending $10 million across 6 states to try to defeat election-denying Republicans, anti-democracy Republicans. Oh, and just this, Rick did say this, but like a bunch of, I want to just sort of step on the point, a bunch of the people leaving are being replaced by election deniers, right? So when you look at 2020, we all know it held by a thread. You mentioned like people like Rusty Bowers, obviously Brad Raffensperger, who, by the way, we did a bunch to help in the primary, because he was running against a guy named Jody Heiss, who Trump handpicked to run against Raffensperger. Luckily, Kemp pulled him over. A bunch of Dems voted in the race, and also I think everybody thought Jody Heiss was a woman, because when I did focus groups, everyone was like, I was like, do you know who Jody Heiss is? And they were like, never heard of her. And I was like, I think Raffensperger can win. They don't know. They don't know who this is. In the swing states, so it is obviously every single election denier on the ballot's very bad, but they have different levels of importance, because the swing states, the contested states, where you're going to have fights, that's where it matters the most. So there are 15 in these like very critical swing states that will decide things, and that's, you guys know what they are, but it's Georgia, it's Wisconsin, it's Arizona, it's Pennsylvania, it's Michigan, it's Wisconsin, and also kind of Ohio. Ohio is super interesting this cycle. But 13 of them are Trump endorsed. He sat out a couple of them. 3 of them are QAnon people, secretaries of state who are QAnon people. 2 of them were actually at January 6th, but there are 9 who are going to control their state's election administration. 4 of them say they wouldn't certify, that they would not have certified 2020. So you guys, I don't know how closely everybody in this room is following politics, but you may have heard that things were very bad for Democrats, the environment, the fundamentals, you know, we are parties in power, there's usually a wave election, we got a tough economy, Joe Biden's been underwater. Then the abortion thing happened, we've got the enthusiasm gap gets closed somewhat, now we're in a dogfight in most of these states. A lot of close races. I want to tell you about some of these people, because I think people are underreacting to what we are facing in 2022. Carrie Lake, these are, I don't know if these are exactly in order of the scariest, but they're in order of the scariest with the highest likelihood of winning. She is the top. Carrie Lake, you will remember I said this to you someday. Actually, I hope you don't have the occasion to remember that I said this to you, but people think Ron DeSantis is the heir to Donald Trump. He's not. This is the true heir to Donald Trump. Carrie Lake, she is MAGA through and through. She's a local celebrity. The reason that she's running against current Secretary of State, Katie Hobbs. When I do the focus groups in Arizona, they all say the same thing. They say, oh, Carrie Lake's been in my living room my whole life. She was a local newscaster. She is extremely attractive, extremely charismatic. She is a total liar. She was apparently an Obama person. Like, she's just had this, weird transformation, but she is committed to it. And those are some of the scariest people who've like recognized the lane they could be in and just committed completely. She is an anti-vaxxing, QAnon flirting, Mike Lindell acolyte, and she has a very good chance of winning in Arizona. And she's going to bring with her this guy, Mark Fincham, one of the people who actually attended January 6th, who's running for Secretary of State, who is one of these QAnon oath keeper guys. If you ever have a chance to talk to the Maricopa County Supervisor, a guy named Stephen Richer, he's a great guy. These guys all are trying to put them in jail, trying to put him in jail. So they talk about how all the election officials should be in jail because of 2020. Arizona's got the most anti-democratic slate because they have governor, they have Secretary of State, and they have this Senator Blake Masters, who's one of this Peter Thiel guys. He's like a kind of a robot, but he's the one who said like the Unabomber had some great ideas. All three of them have a very good shot at winning in Arizona, which is a knife's edge swing state right now, and one of the places where there's going to be fights for the foreseeable future over elections, I think. I don't know if anybody's heard of Herschel Walker. I'm just kidding. Just joking. We get this guy. We ran on election denialism. He's got other problems as well. Tudor Dixon. I'll just say, I just did a focus group in Georgia. It's the episode that's coming out next week, actually. Swing state voters was pretty interesting. It was a younger group, mostly 40 and under. They were all going to go Kemp and Warnock. 2020 is going to be interesting in terms of split tickets, I think. But I still think this guy can win. I mean, I didn't know. I don't follow football that closely. I didn't know until I started doing I was like, why this guy? And then I started doing focus groups, and he's like a god. I remember the first one I did, I was saying to the group, have you heard about this allegation that he would play Russian roulette with himself, like in front of people? And people were kind of like, Russian roulette, what's that? And it's like, well, you put a bullet in the gun, you put a live bullet in the gun, and he'd spin the chamber, point it at his head, play it while there were people in his house. One of the women was like, well, I guess Herschel kept winning. Okay. That's how we think about Herschel Walker, the football player, the god. So I just don't count him out, even with all this stuff. Normal political gravity doesn't quite apply. Tudor Dixon's probably going to lose. I think Gretchen Whitmer's okay. But Christina Caramo, this is one of the craziest secretaries of state people. She's a big QAnon follower. I think that as long as Whitmer really, is this too much? Tell me if like this is it. Tell me if you're like, I don't really care about who these people are. But this guy, Jim Marchant, he is the head of something called the America First Secretary of State Coalition. Are we familiar with this coalition? Guess what this coalition is centered around. It's a bunch of people running for Secretary of State or existing Secretaries of State who believe that the election was stolen. This guy's the head of it. And Nevada, I said these were in order. That's wrong. There's not. Because this guy actually has a very good chance of winning. Christina Caramo does not. Nevada is one of the states that Democrats are most likely to lose this cycle. Cortez Masto, who's the Democratic incumbent, is underwater because of the Democrats' slide with Hispanic voters, which is a real problem for Democrats. It looks like Joe Lombardo, who's actually, he's not like the rest of them. She's the sheriff right now. That he will win for governor. This guy, Adam Laxalt, could win for senator against Cortez Masto. And Laxalt was the guy with Rick Grinnell and Matt Schlapp, who was running around Nevada after the 2020 election trying to overturn the results. Well, if you remember that was a big thing they were doing. And this is their guy. So he's the head of that, and he may very well be it's going to be another contested state. Arizona, Nevada. So I have this up here because J.D. Vance was just like me. And now I do mean just like me, Sarah Longwell. He was a never Trumper in 2016, 2017, very outspoken, just like Carrie Lake. He realized there was a lane, went through a personality transformation, grew that weird beard, and became like a full-on total Trumper. Elections stolen, everything's rigged, and I will say, so he's running against Tim Ryan. Tim Ryan is running the best campaign in Ohio, like of all the Senate candidates. It's actually really terrific. It's going to be really tough. It's Trump plus 8 state. But I did a focus group of women who voted for Trump in 2020 and Sherrod Brown at 18. They love this guy, and not this guy, the other guy, Ryan. So I do think I've got a little bit of hope for this one. So this guy is the actual scariest person, but Doug Mastriano, have you guys heard of him? He was at January 6th, campaign funds to bust people to January 6th. He's one of the only people, besides Herschel Walker, who has actually no exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. And the good news, I guess, is that he's raised no money, he's doing no TV. The episode of the podcast that we did is all about how he doesn't talk to the media. And Josh Shapiro is actually the Democrat, is the AG in the state and is quite good and is raised like $1 gajillion. And so I don't think he's going to win, but he did get through a Republican primary, and people should be really paying attention to the fact that all of these people, Trump endorsed them, they all got through Republican primaries. There's only one state that mattered where Trump didn't get the people he wanted, and that's Georgia. This is who is up against Evers in Wisconsin. He wants to get rid of their bipartisan, you guys should care about this, the election. So he wants to get rid of their bipartisan election commission, replace it with someone partisan. He wants to go back to the 1849 abortion law, which is what happens when they repeal it in the state. They will revert back to the 1849 law, which laws made before the Civil War are often not great in application to today. But I actually, this part, so in Doug Mastriano, the Pennsylvania guy who busts people to January 6th, he's the only one of these governor's races that the RGA is sitting out. They're in for Carrie Lake. Are you guys from Arizona or are you from other places? Okay, so Ducey, good Republican. Okay, Ducey tried to beat Lake in the primary, like put up a real fight. He and Pence came in, nominated a semi-normie. Their attacks on Lake was that she was a Democrat, not that she's a lunatic election denier, and they lost. And then he decided to back her, and they are pushing, and they're also backing this guy. As somebody who has tried to look for the silver lining over these years, because the years have been an evolution for me, a lot of it in the beginning was, well, who are the good guys? Who can we rely on? Who are the good Republicans? How do you get more of them? How do you amplify them? Like Ducey was always on the list. But one of the things that is becoming clear in 22, all my best people, Sununu, he's supporting Baldock in New Hampshire. That guy they're all crazy election deniers. Some of them are like slightly crazier than others. Baldock was like really out there on the edge. And Sununu, Brian Kemp, who certified the election last time, deserves a lot of credit. It's actually the bare minimum we expect people to do, but there was this intense pressure, but he's supporting the ticket. Herschel Walker, the lieutenant governor that is running on the ticket, is a total election denier. The Republican Party has made its peace with the fact that it's going to support these guys. Mastriano's the only one sitting out, and they're sitting it out because he can't win more than anything else. So just one other point I'll make about these state legislatures. They're all controlled by Republicans. I'm not going to try to have a conversation in this room with people who are much smarter about all this stuff than I am, about like independent state legislature theory and about what they were trying to do in 2020 by sending alternate slates of electors. But it will matter a great deal in these contested states when you have governors, when you have secretaries of state, and when you have state legislatures that are all replete with election deniers. Can you guys make that play? You people there? Just real quick.
What, we're going to take over the election apparatus. American citizens that are volunteering. I understand that you don't think that's democracy because the globalists have kind of done an insurrection play and have everybody looking the other way. No. Those days are over. Because this audience has given of themselves before. They've been in the military, they've been police officers and first responders. They volunteered for their country before. They've taken an oath to the Constitution before. And guess what? They are now going to volunteer again to become a precinct committeeman. They're going to volunteer to become an election official. They're going to come and run for county clerk, over 30 county clerks. They're going to take over the Secretary of State, like Soros tried to do with local DAs and Secretary of State. Soros is smart guy, but we're countering that. We're countering that with the American people, and we're going to be relentless, and we're not going to give up.
So I heard the point made in the room yesterday is people clearly know what's going on, but I have a couple of young guys in my office who have to watch these right-wing shows all day long. Their brains are like melting out of their ears. But if you listen to Steve Bannon every day, he talks about recruiting local election administrators, at every level, things that are unoccupied. He makes that point. He expanded his show an hour, 3 hours to 4, to make an hour's worth of room for all of these local people, because part of the incentive to being one of these election deniers who goes and becomes like a local person is that you can go on Steve Bannon's show and talk about what you're going to do. So I mentioned the democracy thing and whether or not voters care about it. Some of you might say, hey, I saw some polling recently. I heard it on the news. That people suddenly, they do care about democracy, that it matters to them. And I say, you should really dig into the crosstabs if you can find them, because it is not a bunch of swing voters who are like, boy, I'm sure concerned about Republicans and democracy. It's a bunch of Republicans who think that the last election was stolen and that socialist Democrats are going to take over. And so there's I think a thing going on where people don't realize that the people who are most passionate right now about defending democracy are a lot of these Republican voters who think the election was rigged. So started this whole thing by talking about this 4% that I'm constantly thinking about. How do you persuade? But here's the thing about people who voted for Trump in 2016, voted for Biden in 2020, and gave Biden the election. Now there's two things. So one is obviously on both Republicans and Democrats turned a whole bunch more people out in 2020, and so that is like a necessary thing, right? Basically the story is all about who can turn out people. We are in a hyper polarized time where actually people talk about the exhausted majority. I don't believe that to be true. I do not think people are exhausted. I think they're intensely animated. So when you got your turnout on both sides, all that's left to do is persuade these swing voters. And one of the things that is, there's the bad news is that Republicans have nominated terrible anti-democracy candidates. The good news is that they're such bad candidates that even with the conditions being very poor for Democrats, a lot of these swing voters don't want to vote for Doug Mastriano. They don't want to vote for Herschel Walker. They don't want to vote for Tudor Dixon. And so that is, I do think there's a bunch of races that were absolutely winnable for Republicans that they're going to lose this cycle. But the thing to know about the swing voters is like, they are center right in their orientation. They are kind of Republicans who just like can't get there on Doug Mastriano. Democracy, they will still, when you ask people at the beginning of every focus group, What are you thinking about? What are you concerned about? What matters to you? It's the economy. It's inflation. It's crime. Nobody ever says democracy. They don't even really say abortion, even now. It comes up later. It's how they think about extremism with candidates. So when you'll ask about, Adam Laxalt, they'll be able to tell, or Blake Masters, they'll be able to tell you their position on abortion, and it'll kind of layer it into like how the person's really extreme. Sometimes they might get to, they think the elections were stolen, they say that, but it is only some people, and they tend to be some of the most well-informed people. I often describe the swing voters as having a Reagan hangover. And what I mean by that is that you're like, okay, well, who would you like to see run in 2024? They don't want to see Trump run. They do not like Joe Biden. And they're always like, do you think maybe John Kasich or maybe Paul Ryan? And it's like they don't realize how much the party has changed. They don't realize that that's not what it is anymore. So obviously they think January 6th was bad, but it's not changing anybody's vote. It's not something that they're thinking about. But these people don't think that the election was stolen. They think that's nonsense. But 70% of Republicans do believe that. I put this in the slide. When I say they vary by degree, so much of it is like a tribal pose, right? It's like, I say, okay, I'll say the focus group. Who thinks the election was stolen? Okay, why? Well, I went to bed and Trump was winning, and I woke up and Joe Biden was winning. Explain that to me. And if you're like, well, they counted the votes overnight and they kept coming, that's just not a sufficient explanation. But they're they're not committed to like the idea that Venezuela the ghost of Hugo Chavez flipped the votes and controlled the voting machines. But those people are there. Like, there are lots of people who will tell you in a very committed way, like Democrats, they cheat, and this is how they cheated, and they've got very elaborate ideas about how that happened. The numbers make no sense when they tell you the total of people who would have had to vote, but they're just taking Trump's cue on it. But it's important to know that when you say 70% believe the election was stolen, they're not all the same, and that a bunch of them will say like, well, I think something fishy happened, but I don't necessarily think it changed enough votes for Trump to win. So what's going to happen in 22? Even if we win a bunch of those clutch races, there's still going to be a bunch of election deniers. They're going to be swept into office. I don't see, unless there is a blue wave, which I find unlikely, you are going to have at least some swing states that now have election deniers in charge of the elections, and the Republicans are going to control the House. How many people? I'm just curious. How many people think Trump's going to run again? Not that many of you. Like, not everybody. That's good. You should hold on to that optimism. I don't know. I go back and forth on this, but everybody I know who talks to anybody who talks to him says he absolutely is. Which means, and he will run again, and his whole thing will be that he's running for a third term, and that the last election was totally stolen from me. Will continue, and so like I deal in this world. All my friends are like in the democracy space. They are doing all this great work to think about how do you persuade people that the election wasn't stolen, and they're trying to raise money for campaigns to persuade people. And that's good. It's just like, you cannot compete with this guy, and not just Trump, every other, this goes back to the Republican triangle of doom. Trump says it over and over again. And then Ted Cruz says it over and over again. Josh Hawley says it. Every Republican elected official says it, with the exception of the ones who just don't say it but don't dispute it. Ron DeSantis went and campaigned with Doug Mastriano, the one that the RGA won't touch. Glenn Youngkin, our great moderate hope for the future of a post-Trump GOP in a sweater vest, when campaigning with Carrie Lake. Guess what? He is not campaigning with Carrie Lake because he wants to confer upon her some of his normal vest dad energy. He is running with Carrie Lake because he wants some of her base excitement on him for his future, because that is where base voters are. And that's where I'm going to stop that presentation. But I do want to talk, I have a lot of things about the voters. And so for the, how long did I go?
I think we have, don't we have to, Carol? Don't we have to, 15, we saw 25 minutes for questions and answers.
So if people, the voting stuff is just, I was talking to Carol before this, and she was telling me how she's a glass half full kind of person. Me too. I am also a glass half full kind of person. It is what led me to try and talk Larry Hogan into primarying Trump. It is what led me to the idea that, you know, we're going to beat, the only way you beat these bad Republicans is with good Republicans. And over the course of this journey, where I wound up was like, you got to beat these guys with Democrats. And that's, you got to build a big, broad pro-democracy coalition from like Liz Cheney to Liz Warren. And the voters aren't thinking about democracy. I don't think that you can teach them about, like, you can tell them democracy is under threat, but it's just not going to resonate the way that the economy is, their lived experiences. And part of that psychology is sort of for a good reason, which is that they take American democracy for granted. They think it's strong. They think it's fine. And so there's not like, they're not panicked about the state of democracy. I think January 6th was a very unfortunate day, but not a, oh, we are experiencing the same sort of right-wing populism that a lot of the rest of the world's going through, and that it's, you know, going to have a dramatic shape of our politics, and that we may be going into a series of elections in which a bunch of candidates don't accept the results, like as a matter of course, and things are thrown into chaos, which I think that we are much, this is just one person's opinion, much less in danger of elections being stolen. I think we are more in danger of living through now like regular chaos in elections, and everything being litigated. So yeah, I'll stop there. I'm sorry that I was walking not entirely in front of this microphone. I'm pretty loud.
Do you mind if we take Q&A now?
No, do it.
I think we're supposed to do a moderated discussion. I think we
Yeah.
I have a mic too. If you'd like.
Oh,
Yeah.
Go ahead, then, if you hand it out.
Okay.
Thank you for that very depressing presentation. Can I ask a question about the voters? I am a liberal in Arizona who grew up here, and I know, besides the people I'm related to, two types of Republican voters: those that have become Democrats and like actually re-registered, and those that do things like write in Ronald Reagan, literally, on the presidential ballot.
Sure.
And a lot of those voters strike me as the people you're trying to reach,
Yes.
but they don't want to vote for Katie Hobbs or Adrian Fontes. They don't want to vote for Mike Fincham and Carrie Lake either, and they're, I think, likely to just sit out
Yeah.
and not vote. What's the message that gets them comfortable for voting for candidates that they disagree with in every possible way except that democracy should work?
Yeah. So I got a couple different answers to this question. One, I have a pitch to Democrats that's I'm not going to make in this room, but I have a real pitch to Democrats about how they need to realize, if they believe that democracy is under existential threat, I'm not always sure they do. Otherwise, I don't think they would have put money behind, putting a bunch of people into the primaries that were election deniers so that they were easier to beat. I think that's not a good thing to do. And so I think that Democrats have to be the party that builds a big pro-democracy coalition. And like, I have an endless, I talked about Republicans coming to eat their lunch with working class voters. I think that Democrats right now, listening to the swing voters, like, they think Democrats sound like aliens. And the woke stuff is a real thing, and basically anything that originates on a college campus and then is injected into politics is woke. I don't know if anybody, a lot of times that's a bit of an amorphous term, but they know it when they see it. They've got strong feelings about it. So I'll say the one is, I think the Democrats have to take seriously delivering sustained electoral defeats, and that means broadening the coalition. And that's a whole separate presentation, which I give sometimes. Separately, though, sitting out's fine. I mean, I want to get people over the hump. As an operative, we think a lot about net voters. The net voter is one you take from that column and you add to this column, and it's like 2 votes because you took one from them and then you gave one here. Just taking one's okay too, for right now. If people who would vote so that's why the campaigns that I run are Republican voters against Trump and Republican voters against Carrie Lake, because obviously I would like for them to vote for Katie Hobbs, but if they can't get there because just they're constitutionally a Republican, and I don't mean as in the Constitution, I mean as in their core, their tribe, then sit it out. Yes, sir.
I got you.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. And just to reiterate, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in terms of, what's going to stop this is, the Republicans to lose badly and then to have to revisit this. But I'm wondering if you can do a little bit more on the election deniers. I mean, to me, there are 2 categories of them. The people who believe, and this is both Republican and Democrat, that elections they lose are unfair for whatever reason. They suppress the vote. They did all kinds of other corrupt things, but they're not going to the streets. They're not trying to disrupt government affairs. So is that a fair point to make about the election deniers that you're talking about, that people might believe the election was unfair because Trump lost or because whatever other candidate lost, but that's just, how they react to losing, whether it's elections or the stock market or something else. But they're not, it's not going to necessarily corrupt our democracy in that way.
So the way that I talked about the 70%, how it has these variations, it encompasses a lot of different stuff. The election deniers are like that too, to your point, right? For some it's performative, for some it's real. And I go back to my point about margins and my point about it doesn't take that many people to do it for real, to throw us into chaos. If you think about the pressure that was exerted, the political pressure that was exerted in 2020 from hauling Raffensperger to find votes, the way that he was calling Doug Ducey, he had to put his phone, he didn't answer the phone because Trump was trying to get him to overturn the election. Imagine the strength now that most of those people are gone. Imagine Trump runs, and so it's on some level, it doesn't matter. I was just having this conversation with somebody else, right? They're like, well, Ron DeSantis wouldn't really overturn an election, right? Well, I don't know. When Ron DeSantis campaigns with Doug Mastriano, who was at January 6th, happily, I don't know what people will do when Trump's there putting pressure on them. I just don't. And I think that it's the reason I try to get people as exercised as possible and as focused as possible on beating these election deniers and sending a message that they are bad candidates, and also so that they are not in office when that happens. Although I think this was in a slide, and I do want to make the point because I'm in a lot of rooms where everybody is contemplating all of the different little ways that an election could get rigged or stolen or people won't believe in it. I think the number one most likely outcome is Trump wins outright, fair and square.
Howdy, coming from the political world as well, can you speak a little bit to the fundraising opportunity that comes when you talk about election denialism? So if you put that on an email, that is the number one earning campaign email, whether or not it's the number one earning topic. And so how that plays into, you put Trump's name or endorsement on something, you're racking in the dollars, whether you believe him or not. I think sometimes we don't want to talk about money in politics, but whether you believe it or not, in my experience, that gets a lot of money, and you need money to talk to voters, whether or not you're going to win.
This is the best point. It's the best point because it's the thing that as a lapsed Republican, I sometimes go to my Democratic friends and I'm like, "Oh, you wanted big money out of politics? Congrats! Now we're doing small dollar donations," and it has created a totally new incentive structure for people to behave like lunatics because all the fundraising. Marjorie Taylor Greene is one of the #1 fundraisers in Congress, and she raises national money. And I think it's obvious why that is. The incentives for small dollar fundraising are absolutely driving people to do all kinds of crazy things, right? I mean, so one of the C3s I manage has a project called Political Emails, and we just scrape all the political emails, and a bunch of places have used it to see, like, Donald Trump's fundraising juggernaut that he built after he lost the election was all on election denialism. It was all on Stop the Steal. And in fact, it's one of the reasons that, I don't know if you guys have followed like the Rick Scott story about how he's been sort of this failure on the small dollar donor side because they invest all this money. Anybody following this? Well, it's like a nice piece of schadenfreude in some way because they invested all this money early on small dollar donors and they haven't been able to recoup it on small dollar donors because it's all getting sucked up by Trump and the most performative members of Congress. So it's everything's right. So much in politics is about the incentives, and they really have changed toward people being more extreme. Is there anybody else?
I had one of the points on your slide, Sarah, that struck me most significantly was the Republican Party's building a multiracial coalition. I'd like if you would speak to that. I know about the loss.
Wow, right?
It does, but I've also noticed that at every Trump rally, there's African Americans behind him, and
Right,
you know,
right behind. Yep.
so I'd like to hear more about that if you would.
So there's this congressman from Indiana who writes all these memos to Kevin McCarthy, Baker. Great memos. He's not a good guy, but he's actually quite smart. If you look up his memos, they're all about how Donald Trump couldn't quite articulate like an America First agenda. But when I talk to these voters, Trump voters, I say, what do you like about Trump? And they'll say, well, I like his policies. What policies? America First policies. Like what? And so we're like, well, immigration, and how he puts America first. Because it's vibes, first of all. But also what they mean is protectionist trade policies, which were not what Republicans were for back in the day. The idea that what Republicans, and the reason I bring up Baker is he writes these memos, and it's about how to be pro-worker, anti-corporation. Marco Rubio did something not that long ago that I would have been unheard of when I was doing my policy work in the Republican trenches, which is he came out and he endorsed the unionization of the Amazon workers. Well, that's because they're anti-corporations, which are woke, by the way, woke corporations. Workers, businesses that are small, that's who Republicans are for. Democrats are for Wall Street. Democrats are for China. Democrats are for shipping your jobs overseas. Republicans are pro-worker. And that's why it has been amazing to watch them pull this off. But I think if you look at the numbers, it's clear that they are to have the rhetoric in many cases be infused with a kind of racialized contempt for immigrants, and yet they're doing much better with Hispanics. They're doing better with Black men, and it's because they feel like they're better for workers because that is reflected in their rhetoric. I mean, I guess I could talk more about it, but yes.
Great presentation, and even more frightening than I think what we heard yesterday, if that's possible. I want to talk about the flip side of this, about Democrats being the party of Wall Street. Well, Wall Street is not pro-Democrat. And in fact, we've seen these corporations that said they weren't going to give money to election deniers. They've now given money to many members of Congress who voted to reject the election results in Arizona and in Pennsylvania. And one of the things that people who study comparatively how democracies move to authoritarianism is the question of, do you co-opt the corporations, the business community, or does the business community stand strong? Do you have any thoughts on why we're not seeing corporations moving towards Democrats in this way, and what could be done to change that dynamic?
So, such a good question. But I do think it's answered. Again, I'm not great on international stuff, but just taking a look at the right-wing populism across the globe, there's a lot of similar features where your rhetoric is pro-worker, pro-masses. You do it by demagoguing immigration, creating, the walls, the sense of, looking inward. But what was the number one policy achievement of the Trump administration? Big tax cuts. And I mentioned I used to spend a lot of time in think tanks, and I don't go to that many. I don't go to as many. Not at the Heritage Foundation's meetings anymore. But I guarantee you, at all the conservative think tanks, that all the business guys and come and attend, they are still talking about free markets, limited government. You just may have seen Ben Sass just kind of tapped out. He's like, but they're gonna invite a bunch of Republicans who are gonna talk. There's this NPR podcast called Code Switch. I think it was that's what they do. They code switch the elected officials. They talk to voters one way, they talk to these businesses another, and they use the sort of demagoguery to build a populist movement. But most of what they do is still, granting a lot of, they still keep the businesses close. And I'll tell you, so all my work prior to this was with businesses. I mean, they just think Democrats don't understand the economy. And Democrats are still the ones saying, like, what about this regulation? What about this regulation? And so I've been talking to a lot of business groups, and people are definitely concerned about, they're absolutely concerned about what's happening. And they are sort of starting to be like a little worried about democracy. You can kind of get people to buy into the notion that stable democracy is very important for business, right? And so they get that. But they still just look at Democrats from a policy standpoint and do not see allies.
So I was curious about what you said regarding abortion and Dobbs. I mean, I've seen registration numbers in a handful of states that suggest that the largest new registrants are women, and particularly younger women. But I get the sense that you think Dobbs is not going to have that big of an impact on 2022. And I thought I'd just ask if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who tells you like they know what's going to happen with Dobbs is wrong. Like, I just don't know. I will say a lot of the places where you've seen big upticks in registration, they're not necessarily the swing states. Like the narrative when I look, the guy, I'm blanking on his name, but who's been out there, Tom Lobienda. But I read it and I'm like, oh, Kansas, a lot of registration in Kansas because they had a referendum. You can get a referendum on ballots. One of the reasons Whitmer's going to be okay is if you get a specific referendum where people have to turn out to vote on abortion for what the policy in the state is, you see a big uptick. It is not yet clear whether just sheer turnout on the back of frustration by young women, young voters, whether or not it would be like I've never seen anything like it. With 22, we could be in a situation where either way, everyone's gonna be like, yeah, that's what was definitely gonna happen. Like Dobbs was this huge motivator and like blows everybody's minds, and Democrats hold the House. I don't think that's gonna happen, but people will be like, yeah, really, Jews turn out, or they'll be like, Republicans won. You know, it helped close the enthusiasm gap a little bit. You know, the other most motivated group is white men, and I just when I was doing focus groups a year ago, I was telling anybody who would listen to me, I was like, guys, you guys are gonna get crushed. Oh my gosh, the enthusiasm gap. Like, I do the focus groups with Republicans. You'd be like, who do you want to vote for in 2022? Any living, breathing Republican. You'd ask Democrats, you know, what are you going to turn out to vote? Or they're like, I don't really like what Joe Biden's doing. He hasn't like done student loan forgiveness, or like he's either too moderate or he's too progressive. And I was like, man. And the one like, and obviously a bunch of things have happened. Like not just abortion. It was also, you know, he passed a bunch of things that are quite popular with Democrats, and so you've seen his numbers ticking up going in. And like, I could literally make a case for momentum for either side and say, well, look, Joe Biden's numbers are going up. Gas prices have been falling. But then I could look and say, OPEC just restricted, and gas prices are probably going to go up, and a lot of Republicans are coming home. Oz is starting to get competitive in Pennsylvania. You know, I don't know which way things are going to go, but I do think they will probably, usually, actually, I was going to say this, but I don't know that I think it's true. I was going to say things usually break. Like, this is true. Like, a true thing about politics, things usually break one way or the other, and it kind of sweeps either way. But I am not sure that they don't, like, break in very complicated ways, where you have places like Pennsylvania, I said the split ticket thing earlier, where Kemp, I will tell you, this group that I did in Georgia had 3 black women in it. They were all going to vote for Kemp. And they said, I know I should vote for Stacey, but he's fine. He's doing a good job. And so, but they were all like, but Herschel Walker's messy. Like, you know, this guy, I don't know what's going on with this guy. Then he said the same thing about Warnock. He's fine. He's doing a good job. So the idea that there would be these Kemp Warnock voters, this Shapiro, Oz voters, these Lake Kelly voters, is, I think, like one of the things, that would be the thing I'm maybe most confident in saying is going to be a feature of 22. But anyway, I'll just say one other thing about abortion. So when I start the groups, I always ask, you know, how do you think things are going in the country? The answer is bad. Everybody says bad. Catastrophically bad are the answers. And they talk about inflation, they talk about crime, they talk about the economy, they talk about even jobs. Jobs are great. People talk about jobs all the time. They talk about how expensive it is to live and to go to the grocery store. They don't talk about abortion. Rarely. Even since the decision. Then when you go and you say, okay, who will you vote for? Will you vote for Masters or Kelly? They're like, oh, well, Masters is insane on abortion. And I did say this already, but like that's how they define, like that's the thing that leads them to believe that Masters is too extreme, is his position on abortion, and they do know it. So there's no doubt it's going to have an impact. I just think the question is like, do you see some kind of like crazy turnout numbers? I'm a little bit skeptical. Yeah. It's like a whole bunch of words to say I'm not sure.
So I would never ask you or anybody else to predict how you think 2024 is going to go. But you...
I'll take a stab at it. Go ahead.
Well, you know, you'd mentioned that a lot of the swing voters that you're focused on they're not election integrity, democracy, not huge issues for them. And obviously nobody can ever predict what Trump is going to say or how he's going to say it, but he seems uniquely unable to move on from losing.
Yeah.
And he talks about it all the time. Do you think that there's a risk that in 2024, that's all that he talks about? He doesn't talk about actual issues that matter as much, and those kind of swing voters get turned off for that reason?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff in there. So number one, during the January 6th committee, I was doing a bunch of focus groups while the January 6th committee was going. So I was trying to see, like, is this thing breaking through? People, what do they say? And I do a focus group every week. And I've been doing it almost every week for, I don't know, 4 years now or something. In every Trump 2020 group, you say, who do you want to see run in 2024? Half the group says Trump. January 6th committee started, got underway, and we asked the question. We did 9 focus groups while the committee was going. And I had 3 groups in a row, and nobody said Trump. Nobody wanted Trump to run again in 2024. 0 people. I was like, man, this is so weird. And so we were really pushing them because I was like, is this the January 6th committee? And so the way that I characterized it was the committee wasn't so much breaking through as it was seeping in. And what I mean is they were not sitting down to watch the committee. They thought it was stupid, dog and pony show, waste of tax dollars. But it was what I was hearing from them about Trump was he's got a lot of baggage. You know, I think DeSantis, we've got all these stars, these young stars. We'd love to give somebody else a shot. And I think that a big part of, and then people also started to say, because the January 6th committee, what it was doing, it was raising the ambient noise, the salience. It was reminding people that this guy just talks about 2020 all the time. And they were like, they want to talk about Joe Biden having dementia. That's funny. They want to talk about trans people in sports. They want to talk about what people are going to do about inflation. They want the Trump show that's forward looking. A certain kind of voter, not everybody, but there's the ones that want that. And they were starting to be like, just keeps talking about 2020, just keeps relitigating it. Even though they're like, yes, I think so. So, but then, there's the Mar-a-Lago document situation. It's like changed back just like that. Where everybody was like, the FBI is after Trump. And again, these are Trump voters. And so I was getting asked a lot, like, do you think that the Mar-a-Lago search is going to hurt him? And I was like, short term, no. Short term, it's going to help him get the Republican nomination because what Trump wants is for everybody to be talking about Trump all the time. And what he was, and one of the things, the idea, I guarantee you he was doing focus groups just like I was during the January 6th committee. And he was hearing the same thing from voters, which is like, boy, that DeSantis looks real interesting. Trump doesn't want that. And so I think my big take on that I thought he might very well announce before the midterms because he thought DeSantis was getting too much juice, but that the Mar-a-Lago thing got him what he needed without him having to do it, which is everybody talking about him again and defending him against an institution that they think is like the deep state. And I'll tell you another thing that has been alarming, which is that with the swing voters in particular, we always have been asking if Biden and Trump head to head 24, who do you vote for? These people all went Biden in 20. We're seeing a ton of backsliding, and we didn't see that a year ago. A year ago, most people didn't regret their decision. Now people are like, and again, constitutionally Republicans, so they talk about the crime and how it's out of control. They talk about the economy and how bad it is. And you'll get 4 people. And so the Georgia group I did this week, Trump 16, Biden 2020, Kemp, Warnock, Trump, Biden 24, 4 Trump, 2 Biden, 2 extensions. And that is what I'm starting to see. And look, I don't know what to tell Democrats about 24, but I will tell you this. When I do a Republican group, Trump voting group, you ask about 24. You get your people who want Trump, then you get all your people who want somebody else from Trump, and they say, I want DeSantis, #1 name all the time, DeSantis, far and away. It is crazy, actually. It is actually surprising to have so many voters know who the governor of Florida is. That is just, from a voter standpoint information, it's surprising how high his name ID is. They also like Kristi Noem. A lot of them, it gets a little regional. Greg Abbott, what's his name, who ran the State Department, Mike Pompeo, people who are part of the America First Fox News cinematic universe. That's who they want. They got all these names, all these stars that they like. You ask Democrats, do you want to see Joe Biden run again? 0 people say yes. Then you say, all right, who else would you like to see? And they just stare at you. And eventually somebody can kind of cough up AOC, and then the rest of the group will shout no at that person. And that's basically the dynamic among Democrats. And so the reason I'm willing to speculate about 2024, my speculation about 2024 is I have been slowly, I was just sure we couldn't rerun Biden Trump. Just positive we couldn't. And I've become less sure of that every day. And I'm less sure every day, you know, Biden thinks he has to run again if it's Trump because he thinks he's the only one who could beat Trump. Which he absolutely was the only one who could beat him in 20. And I'm not sure he can beat him again. We had COVID in 20 and we didn't have to go anywhere. We didn't have to do speeches. Sorry.
We're about out of time, but one more question. There's Rick, do you want to go ahead? Well, let's see anybody else.
So I wanted to come back to your slide about election denialism among Democrats. I took a lot of grief in my book before January 6th, talking about the problems with Stacey Abrams refusing repeatedly to call Kemp the legitimate governor of Georgia. And you mentioned also the Democrats backing Mastriano and other election deniers in the primary as a way of trying to create weaker candidates, some of which is probably going to backfire. And you and I were in a meeting at Harvard before COVID talking about court packing. I don't know if you remember that, but I remember you rolling your eyes in that meeting. And I'm just wondering how you think swing voters will react if they see Democrats as being as much of a norm breaker as Republicans. Does that become a kind of wash?
Yeah, okay. So this is such an important, the whataboutism is a really important dynamic. It's a really important mental tool to allow people to have permission to do things that are bad. So for example, in 2016, Donald Trump, Access Hollywood, sexual predation should be a huge problem for him. The problem is his opponent is Hillary Clinton, whose husband is the most high-profile sexual predator that people remember for 25 years. What it did is it created a draw. Nobody had the moral high ground. I cannot tell you how important this is. Last night, very stupidly, I don't know why I was doing this. It was because I was on East Coast time. I was on Twitter. I got in a fight with Ted Cruz on Twitter, and I was arguing with all these like antis about Herschel Walker because I had said, you cannot vote for this person. Republicans cannot. Why aren't they denouncing him? Why aren't they walking away from him? And the answer, I was raised on a conservative philosophy of character counting. It was central to the identity, in part because it was forged in contrast to Bill Clinton. 1998, I'm 18 years old, and, I thought he was a real dirtbag. And I think that so I said this about Herschel Walker. Everybody's tweeting pictures of Ted Kennedy. These Republicans. And I'm like, your what about is so old that photo's in black and white. Your what about on this is like Bill Clinton and Ted Kennedy. But here's the thing. Moral high ground is important on this stuff. Moral high, in my opinion, because voters will say that and the Stacey Abrams thing is the nullification on the election denialism, and people who elected to Trump in 2016 who didn't certify. There were some Congress people, and if you don't have the moral high ground, if you can't say that this is wrong, if you can't say that your side upholds this standard too. It's the whole point, right, of the democracy is that you uphold the same standards. That's rule of law. That's this whole ballgame. And so I know it was just one bullet point, but and that's part of the reason I'm not harping on it is I don't know what this room is politically, whatever. But if I was in a room with a bunch of Democratic elected officials, I would be telling them that they better be as pure as the driven. So this is what they did about Bill Clinton and Me Too, right? This is why Franken's gone. That's why Katie Hill resigned, is because they were trying to look for some. And we were it was called Constitutional Hardball, was the name of that conference. And I was against all of it because it was all about the tit for tat, the vortex of backlashes, the Montagues and Capulets, those cowboy families, what were they? Hatfields and McCoys. In all those stories, everyone ends up dead, right? They're all dead at the end. And so somebody has to seize the moral high ground. Somebody has to end that. And there's only one option. So I think that Democrats should take that obligation extremely seriously.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much.
Someone stop it.